Today we're going to take a look at the Sync, Hit, or Untouched challenge from Topcoder. Now this seems to be the beginning of a battleship game. So I've built out the main method, damaged or sunk, and this method is going to return a hash that contains the number of ships that were hit or sunk, the number of ships that were hit but not sunk, and then the number of missed ships. Then also in that hash will be the total points um, that were scored for that attack round. So again, the main method is called damaged or sunk, and it takes in two parameters, the board and the attacks. Um, so I've basically just run damaged or sunk. When I run damaged or sunk, it calls the score assault method that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Um, Once it does that, that is the hash that's going to be returned, or score assault will return the hash that we're looking for. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at score assault. Now, score assault also takes in the board and the attacks. And then it creates a hash that contains the four parameters that we're looking for, or four keys we're looking for: sunk, damaged, not touched, and points. Now each of these are set to 0 initially, and then will score out as each of the boats are marked. The next thing I do is I create another hash called boats. Now boats is built by using the mark attacks method that I created just up here. Now mark attacks also takes in the board and the attacks and creates a hash of boats that calls the mark boats method. Now mark boats method only takes in one parameter, and that's board. Now notice here I put, when I call this method, I put in board.reverse. Now the reason I do this is because when we're building out the board is built using a 0 index, and the 0 index for each of these rows starts from, or goes from left to right, and then the column, each of the columns goes from top to bottom. However, in the game itself, it notes the board as going from bottom to top along the y-axis. So when I call reverse, it actually reverses the order of these rows here, and then will actually be able to score the board as the board's laid out via the game. Okay, so again, I call mark boats. It takes in that board, but the board as reversed. And what it does here is it checks the board for each row, each with index, and then the row for each column. And then if boats column is equal to nil, and notice the boats was set up as a hash here, it sets the boats column equal to an array that contains an array of j plus 1 and I minus or I plus 1, unless the column equals 0, because we're not worried about the 0 columns or the 0 spaces in the board, because that just means a boat's not there, so we don't have to actually put that into the hash. And we'll actually mess up the method should we put zeros in the hash, because it will just think that's a boat, and it's not, obviously. Now the reason I add +1 here is because, again, if we go back to our board, we'll notice that it's not 0 indexed. And because it's not 0 indexed, then I have to add 1 to each of my boats marked on the board, because my board is 0 indexed. And if I don't do that, then all of our attacks, because they're also marked on the 1 index rather than the 0 index, it'll just note as misses, or it will be a misfire, if you will. So again, if there's nothing in the boats at the column, it sets boats column equal to an array that contains another array of the indices for the column and row. Then, if the boats.column does exist, it just pushes that next array at the column and row. Then finally, it will return boats as the hash, where all the boats are labeled by their boat number, which is what that column is marking as. So the boat number with its locations at the arrays that have been passed or pushed into that value. So again, going back to mark attacks, then for each attack, so remember we're taking in attacks here, it's going to call the boats, which we created, the boats hash, the key values, and it's going to check the value of boats key at the index, and it's going to place an X at that index if boat is equal to attack. So if there's a boat mark in that space, it's going to place an X so that we know that boat was hit. Then it's going to return the boats with the hit marks made. And then finally, we're going back to score assault. So after the boats with the hit marks made hash is returned, it's going to check each of the boats in that boats hash. So again, calling boats.keys.each. At each key, if the boats.key, or if the boats value for that key contains all X's, so if there's no like grid marker in there, that boat was sunk. So it scores, or it adds to the sunk key 1, and adds the point value for a sunken ship, which is 1. Else, if the values at that particular key contain an X, but they're not all X's, it's going to be a damaged boat, which increases the damaged value by 1, and the points value by 0.5. And then finally, if a boat was not hit, so if we're going through the boats hash and a boat does not have an X mark in any of the grid locations, that means that boat was not touched. So my not touched key is going to increase by 1, and then the score is actually going to decrease by 1 for each boat not hit. All right, so finally I have the test block, which I'm building into this program just in case it's run on its own. So if I run that, and I've called this file battleship.rb, I'm just making an assumption here. So I run that, and you'll notice that the requested hash at the end has been marked. So 0 boats were sunk, 2 boats were damaged, 1 boat was not touched, and the points awarded were 0.0. Again, I have a float here rather than an integer because we are dealing with half points for damaged boats. And if I made that an integer and we ended up with a half, it would just mark that to the next or the nearest integer, and we wouldn't have the actual score here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a float for that purpose. And then finally, I did build a test file for this. It wasn't necessarily asked for, but I did build a test file just to show that each of these methods actually work for what they are. So I've created 2 boards. One is the test board that's going to test the individual methods so that we can see how it's being scored. Then I've built the main test board, which is basically what we saw in the file itself in that test block. I've set up 3 different attack series. Attacks 1 is the block that we got from the challenge itself. So when we're running against the board, we will actually get 2 hits, 1 miss, and end up with a score of 0. But if it runs against the test board, it's going to score 1 hit, which will show us that, and no sinks, and will show us a final score of 0.5. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real fast. So it marks and scores a hit. So it's going to expect the damage or sunk, which is the main method that we're calling, and the test board and attacks 1 parameters passed into that. which will then should equal sunk 0, damaged 1, not touched 0, and final score or final points of 0.5. The next one, it marks and scores a sunken ship. So this is if a ship is hit on every single occasion, in which I built the attacks 2 method, which will actually score a hit on each of the 3 spaces in the board. So it should score a sunk 1, damage 0, not touch 0, and award us a final score of 1. And then finally, or I'm sorry, not finally, next I need to make sure that the not touched is scoring appropriately. So marks and scores a miss. So it will run damaged and sunk, again against the test board, and it will run attacks 3, which will basically hit all of these zeros in that first column. And so sunk 0, damage 0, not touched 1, and my score then is -1. And then finally, I go ahead and run the test block that was passed from the challenge. So again, I'm running the actual board, and you can see the similarity between this board and the board that was given at the challenge, and the attacks 1 again, which is again the attacks from the challenge. In which case, we get 0 sunken ships, 2 damaged ships, 1 not touched ship, and then the points awarded were ultimately 0. All right, so let's go ahead and run that RSpec real fast. So bundle exec RSpec. It should be under the spec folder called battleship spec.rb. We have 4 examples, 0 failures, and that's it. So again, if there are any questions, just go ahead and feel free to post them in the forum. I will answer them as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.